Eliot Harper had always been the skeptical type. The city journalist who prided himself on uncovering the truth, no matter how bizarre the stories might seem. So when he was assigned to cover the town of Morrow's Hollow, a place that had garnered attention due to its strange rumors and tales of disappearances, he thought little of it. It would be the perfect chance to debunk the myths and deliver a story with a rational explanation. Nothing more than small-town legends clinging to a decaying place that time had forgotten. Arriving on a late autumn evening, Eliot immediately noticed how the town seemed stuck in the past. The cobbled streets were quiet, save for the occasional creak of a shutter being caught by the wind. The buildings leaned against each other like aging neighbors who had grown tired of looking after themselves. The streetlights flickered above him, casting shadows that seemed to stretch farther than they should have. There was an unsettling stillness to the town, a silence that seemed to swallow everything whole. Eliot checked into the only inn in town, the Hollow Inn, an old, unkempt building with a faded sign swinging above the door. The woman behind the counter, perhaps in her 60s, was pale, with dark eyes that seemed to pierce through him as though she could read his thoughts. "You're new here," she said, her voice a gravelly whisper. Eliot nodded, trying to maintain his composure despite the odd energy that hung in the air. "Yes, just for a few days. I'm here to write a piece on the town." The woman studied him with an unreadable expression before sliding a key across the counter. "Room 3. Don't stay out too late," she added, almost as if warning him. Eliot took the key and headed up the narrow staircase. The hallway was dim, with peeling wallpaper and flickering lights. As he walked, he felt an unsettling sensation, as though the shadows were somehow watching him. But when he turned to check, the hallway was empty, as it should have been. He entered room 3, a small, simple space with a single bed, a faded quilt, a window overlooking the empty streets, and a large, ornate mirror hanging on the far wall. It was out of place in such a rundown room, its frame carved with intricate designs that seemed too detailed for a town like Morrow's Hollow. Eliot approached the mirror, curious. He stared at his own reflection for a moment, trying to make sense of the eerie quiet that surrounded him. But as he examined the mirror, something caught his eye. A figure, pale, with long, dark hair, appeared behind him. He spun around, but there was no one there. His heart raced, and his breath came out in shallow gasps. It was just a trick of the light, he told himself. Maybe he was more tired than he realized. But as he turned back to the mirror, the figure was still there, only now it was closer. The woman's face was pale as if drained of life, her eyes black as pitch. She smiled, but it was a twisted, unnatural smile that stretched too wide. Eliot's stomach lurched. This was no ordinary reflection. She was no reflection at all. She was something else. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body refused to obey. His hand trembled as he reached for the door, but before he could touch the handle, a voice, soft and breathy, filled the air around him. "Leave now, before it's too late." Eliot froze, his blood running cold. The voice wasn't coming from the woman in the mirror, it was coming from everywhere. The wall seemed to hum with it, the floor beneath him vibrating with the faintest tremor, as though the house itself were alive. "Leave now," the voice repeated, this time clearer, louder. He spun around, his heart pounding in his chest. The mirror reflected only his own wide-eyed face. But the room, the very air, seemed to have thickened, as though something invisible was pressing in from all sides. Eliot stepped toward the door again, this time determined to leave, but when he reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. He tugged at it desperately, but the door remained locked, sealed shut. The whisper came again, louder now, as though it were not a warning but a command. "You're not meant to be here, Eliot." The cold seeped into his bones. He could feel the air grow heavier, the shadows darker, as if the very room had become alive. The walls groaned, creaking under the strain of something unseen. A sharp scratching sound, like claws scraping against stone, suddenly filled the room. It came from somewhere in the corner, near the window. Eliot's breath hitched as he turned his head, searching for the source of the noise. But there was nothing there, just the window, the streetlights casting long shadows outside. Still, the scratching continued, a rhythmic, frantic sound that seemed to be moving closer. Eliot backed away slowly, his eyes fixed on the mirror, which now reflected not just him, but something else, something wrong. The woman's face had twisted, her eyes growing wider, her smile stretching to an impossible length. She leaned closer in the reflection, her breath fogging up the glass, and for the first time, Eliot heard her speak. This time, her voice wasn't just a whisper. It was a chilling, guttural hiss. "You cannot leave," she said, her voice echoing in his mind, reverberating through his skull. The scratching had stopped. Silence filled the room once more. But Eliot's pulse hammered in his ears. He could feel the weight of unseen eyes on him, pressing down on his chest. He reached for the door again, but his hand froze just before it made contact. The mirror seemed to shift. The reflection was no longer just him. Behind him, in the darkness of the mirror, stood something tall and twisted, a figure that had not been there before. Its form was warped, its limbs impossibly long, its skin pale and stretched over its bones like a corpse left too long in the ground. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, hollow pits that seemed to stare right through him. Eliot turned quickly, but there was nothing behind him in the room. Just the bed. The dresser. The window. He turned back to the mirror. The figure was still there, moving now, stepping closer to him in the reflection. And with each step, the room seemed to grow colder, darker. Shadows crept along the walls, gathering like smoke in the corners of the room. "Leave," the woman in the mirror whispered again, her voice coming from both her reflection and his mind. "Before it finds you." A sickening, primal fear gripped Eliot's chest. He wanted to run, to escape, but his body refused to cooperate. His legs felt weak, his arms heavy as though the very air in the room was weighing him down. The figure in the mirror stepped closer, its long fingers twitching as if preparing to reach out and touch him. He had to move. He had to get out. His mind raced. He had to do something, anything, to stop this. He reached out once more for the door, yanking it with all his strength, but it remained locked, stubbornly refusing to give. The figure in the mirror was almost upon him now. Its smile, a jagged, crooked thing, was wide enough to swallow him whole. Then, the walls groaned again. This time, louder. A deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the floorboards. The shadows seemed to pulse with life, crawling toward him, inch by inch. The woman's reflection was gone now, replaced by the figure that stood before him, its mouth opening slowly as though it were about to speak. But before it could, the mirror cracked, spiderweb cracks spidered across the glass, splintering the reflection into pieces. A low, guttural sound filled the air, like the growl of something ancient and monstrous, rising from the depths of the earth. Eliot screamed, the sound of his own voice deafening in the otherwise silent room. He turned toward the door, pulling at the handle again with all his strength, but the door refused to budge. The scratching returned, closer now, louder, and something scraped against the other side of the door, as if eager to get through. Then, without warning, the mirror shattered completely. The figure, no longer confined to the reflection, stepped forward, reaching out with impossibly long arms. Its fingers curled around his neck, cold and deathly still. The last thing Eliot saw was the woman's pale, smiling face behind the figure, as though watching him with glee. He gasped for breath, but it was already too late. The shadows had claimed him.